Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had a birthday everyone forgot? And subscribe so you do not miss the next story. The saddest part of growing older isn't that people forget your birthday, Charlotte Hayes thought. It's the moment you stop expecting them to remember. She stared at the tiny candle trembling in the center of a 6-inch vanilla cake and tried to convince herself she was fine. Outside, rain tapped softly against the cafe windows, turning the streets of downtown Seattle into rivers of gold and silver reflections beneath the city lights. Inside, laughter drifted from nearby tables. Glasses clinked. Friends leaned close to tell stories. Couples shared desserts. Families crowded around oversized birthday cakes covered in bright candles and cheerful decorations. Charlotte sat alone. She wrapped both hands around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold and glanced at her phone for what felt like the 100th time. The screen remained stubbornly dark. No messages. No missed calls. No notifications. 28 years old today. Not even a simple text. Not even a single happy birthday. A faint smile appeared on her lips, though it never reached her eyes. She locked the phone and slipped it face down onto the table. It shouldn't have hurt this much. She told herself that repeatedly. Life was busy. People had their own problems. Everyone was trying to survive. She understood that. She really did. Yet understanding something never made it sting less. Especially on nights like this. Especially when she could still remember being 8 years old, sitting between her parents at a backyard picnic while her mother placed a paper crown on her head and insisted birthdays were magical. Back then, she believed her mother. Back then, she believed lots of things. The young waitress approached carrying a small plate and smiled apologetically. We're closing in about 30 minutes, hon. Charlotte nodded politely. That's okay. Birthday? The waitress asked, noticing the candle. Charlotte hesitated before giving a small shrug. Apparently, the waitress offered a sympathetic smile. Well, happy birthday anyway. Thank you. The woman walked away, and the silence returned. Charlotte looked around the room. Nobody was watching her. Nobody cared that she sat alone with a marked-down cake she had bought herself on the way home from work, pretending a tiny table for one did not feel like a verdict. Earlier that morning, she had spent 10 hours covering shifts at a retail store because another employee had called in sick. Her feet still ached. Her shoulders felt heavy. Her tiny apartment waited for her across town, along with a stack of unpaid bills and a refrigerator that looked depressingly empty. Yet somehow the loneliness hurt more than any financial problem. She reached into her purse and removed a lighter. The tiny flame flickered to life. A second later, the candle glowed warmly atop the cake. Charlotte stared at it. One small light. One small wish. One small reminder that another year had passed. She closed her eyes. Around her, conversations blended into soft background noise. Rain whispered against the glass. Somewhere near the counter, a coffee grinder hummed briefly before falling silent. Charlotte drew a slow breath and made a wish she would never tell another person. I wish someone would sit with me tonight. Not save me. Not rescue me. Not change my life. Just sit with me. When she opened her eyes, the candle still burned. Nothing else had changed. She laughed quietly at herself. What a ridiculous wish. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for her to say it out loud, the front door suddenly opened. A gust of cold rain-scented air swept into the cafe. Several customers glanced toward the entrance before returning to their conversations. Charlotte barely looked up. Then she noticed the man standing there. He looked close to 40, though the exhaustion in his face made age difficult to guess. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark coat soaked from the storm. Water dripped from his hair onto the floor as he paused beneath the doorway light. There was nothing flashy about him. No dramatic entrance. No obvious sign of wealth. Yet something about him felt different. Maybe it was the exhaustion in his expression, or the way he stood completely still for a moment, as though he had forgotten why he came inside in the first place. The young waitress approached him. Charlotte couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw the woman gesture apologetically toward the clock. The cafe was nearly closed. The stranger nodded and glanced around the room. His eyes moved past crowded tables, past families, past couples, then landed on Charlotte. She quickly looked away. A few seconds later, she heard footsteps approaching. Slow, unhurried. She assumed he was walking toward another table, until the footsteps stopped directly beside her. Charlotte looked up. The stranger stood there holding a simple black umbrella. Rainwater still glistened on his coat sleeve. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His gaze drifted toward the tiny cake, toward the single candle, toward the empty chair across from her. Then he looked back at her. There was no pity in his eyes, no awkwardness, only a strange kind of recognition, as if he understood something without needing it explained. Charlotte felt unexpectedly self-conscious. "Can I help you?" she asked softly. The corner of the man's mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. He glanced once more at the cake, then at the empty chair, then back at her, and in a calm voice that somehow carried above every sound in the room, he asked a question so unexpected that Charlotte forgot how to breathe. "Would it be terribly selfish," he said, "if I borrowed a little of your birthday tonight?" Charlotte blinked once, certain she had misheard him. The candle continued to flicker between them, casting a small circle of gold light across the table. Around them, the cafe carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. A couple near the window laughed at a private joke. Someone collected a takeout order near the counter. Rain tapped steadily against the glass. Yet for Charlotte, the entire room seemed to pause. The stranger remained standing beside the empty chair. He did not smile. He did not appear embarrassed. He simply waited for her answer with the patience of someone who had spent a long time waiting for many things. Charlotte let out a nervous laugh. "Borrow my birthday," she repeated. "That is probably the strangest thing anyone has ever asked me. I suspected it might be." His voice was calm and warm, carrying a quiet honesty she found difficult to ignore. "The answer is still no if you want it to be." Charlotte studied him carefully. His coat was expensive, though not flashy. His watch looked simple. His face was handsome in a way that seemed almost accidental. There was a tiredness around his eyes that no amount of money could erase. Most of all, he looked alone. Not physically alone. Lonely. There was a difference. She knew because she recognized it. "Why would you want to borrow a stranger's birthday?" she asked. The man glanced briefly toward the rain-covered window. "Because mine has not gone very well." Charlotte frowned. "It is your birthday too?" For the first time, a genuine smile touched his face. Small, brief, real. "Yes. You are serious." Unfortunately, Charlotte stared at him for another moment before looking at the empty chair. Then back at him. "You know this sounds like the opening scene of a true crime documentary, right?" The man laughed unexpectedly. A real laugh. Deep and genuine. Several people nearby glanced over. "That is fair," he admitted. "I promise I am significantly less interesting than that." "That is exactly what the charming suspect says in episode 1. His smile widened. "You make a strong argument." Charlotte found herself smiling too, against her better judgment. The feeling surprised her. It had been a difficult day, a lonely day, yet somehow this absurd conversation felt lighter than anything else she had experienced in weeks. She looked at the chair again. All right. You can sit down." "Thank you." The stranger pulled out the chair and settled into it. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Instead, the waitress approached, carrying a menu. "Would you like anything before we close?" she asked the man. "Just a black coffee, please." "Coming right up." The waitress disappeared again. Charlotte folded her arms on the table. So, if we are sharing birthdays, I should probably know your name." "Ethan." "Just Ethan. That is usually how names work." Charlotte rolled her eyes. "Charlotte. Nice to meet you, Charlotte." Something about the way he said her name sounded sincere, not flirtatious, not rehearsed, just kind. Ethan looked at the little cake. "Vanilla?" It was on sale. An excellent reason to buy cake. "You sound passionate about discounted desserts." "I have strong opinions on many important subjects, such as coffee, books, cake." An impressive list. "Thank you." The waitress returned with his coffee and placed it on the table. Ethan thanked her before wrapping both hands around the cup. The steam rose between them. Outside, the rain intensified, blurring the city lights into streaks of color. Charlotte noticed him staring at the candle. Not casually, thoughtfully, as if it reminded him of something. "Bad birthday?" she asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. "Something like that. You do not have to tell me." "I know." He looked down at his coffee. "Have you ever noticed that some dates seem to follow you no matter how hard you try to escape them?" Charlotte nodded slowly. "Yes. For most people, birthdays are celebrations. For most people. For me, they became reminders." His gaze remained fixed on the cup. Charlotte sensed there was more to the story, but she did not push. She knew what it felt like when strangers demanded explanations for pain they had not earned the right to hear. Instead, she picked up the plastic knife beside the cake. Well, she said gently, if you are borrowing part of my birthday, I suppose that includes the cake. Ethan looked up. You are sure? It would be rude not to share. I would hate to be rude. Charlotte carefully cut the cake down the middle. Half for her, half for him. She slid one plate across the table. Ethan stared at it for a second. Then something unexpected happened. His expression softened completely. The guarded look disappeared from his face. For a brief moment, he looked younger. Almost vulnerable. What? Charlotte asked. Ethan shook his head. Nothing. That was definitely something. He picked up the plate. It has just been a very long time since someone shared a birthday cake with me. Charlotte felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. She looked around the crowded cafe again. All those people. All that noise. Yet somehow the two loneliest people in the room had ended up at the same table. And neither of them had seen it coming. The rain continued to drum softly against the windows while the last few customers prepared to leave. Charlotte took a small bite of cake and watched Ethan do the same. Neither of them seemed in any hurry to fill the silence. It was an unusual kind of quiet. Not awkward, not forced. The kind that appeared when two strangers unexpectedly stopped pretending they were fine. Ethan set down his fork and glanced toward the street. Reflections from passing cars slid across the glass like ribbons of light. You know, he said, when I was younger, I thought loneliness was something that happened only when you were physically alone. Charlotte nodded. And then life corrected me. A faint smile touched her lips. Life is very committed to that job. Ethan laughed softly. It really is. Charlotte studied him for a moment. There was something strange about sitting across from a man she had met less than half an hour ago and feeling more understood than she had by people she had known for years. Maybe it was because neither of them had anything to prove. No expectations. No history. No obligations. Just 2 birthdays and a storm outside. What do you do, Ethan? She asked. He hesitated for the briefest moment. Business. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. That is impressively vague. It is technically accurate. That makes it even more suspicious. Fair point. She laughed. I work retail. Long hours. Too many. You look tired. Thank you. That is exactly what every woman dreams of hearing on her birthday. Ethan immediately looked horrified. That came out wrong. Charlotte burst into laughter. A genuine laugh this time. The kind she had not heard from herself in weeks. Ethan shook his head. I meant you look exhausted. Which somehow sounds worse. Remarkably worse. I should stop talking. Probably. The warmth of the conversation settled around them like a blanket. Charlotte realized she had completely forgotten to check her phone. Most evenings were spent scrolling through social media, watching other people appear happy, watching birthdays filled with friends, dinners, holidays, celebrations. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, she was living inside a moment instead of measuring it against someone else's highlight reel. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Depends. Why did you stay? Charlotte frowned. Stay where? Here. Tonight. He gestured toward the small cake. Most people would have taken it home. She looked at the candle. The flame had grown smaller, but still burned steadily. I do not know. She considered the question carefully. Maybe because if I went home, it would make everything feel official. Official. That the day was over. Ethan nodded slowly, as though he understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes endings are harder than disappointments, he said quietly. Charlotte felt something tighten in her chest. Yes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe lights reflected in the polished tabletop. Somewhere behind the counter, chairs were being stacked. Closing time was getting closer. Ethan stared at the tiny candle again. Can I tell you something ridiculous? Absolutely. When I walked past this cafe tonight, I was not planning to come inside. Charlotte listened carefully. What changed your mind? Ethan looked directly at her. I saw the candle. The answer surprised her. Just the candle? Just the candle. He smiled faintly. Everyone else was looking at the people around them. You were sitting alone staring at one small light like it was the most important thing in the world. Charlotte glanced down. That sounds sad. No, his voice was gentle. It looked hopeful. The words caught her off guard. Hopeful was not how she would have described herself tonight. Tired. Invisible. Forgotten. Maybe. Hopeful had not made the list. Yet hearing someone else see it changed something. A small shift. Barely noticeable. But real. The waitress approached carrying her handbag and jacket. I am sorry, friends, she said warmly. We are officially closed. Charlotte looked around. The cafe was now empty except for them. Somehow an hour had disappeared. Ethan stood immediately. "Thank you for letting us stay." "No worries," the waitress replied. "And happy birthday to both of you." They thanked her and gathered their things. Charlotte carefully picked up the remaining half of the cake. Outside, the rain had eased into a gentle mist. The city felt quieter now. Streetlights glowed above wet pavement. The cool air carried the scent of rain and coffee. For a moment, they stood beneath the awning together, neither moving, neither quite ready to end the evening. Charlotte looked at the nearly empty street, then at Ethan. Well, this has been the strangest birthday of my life. I was afraid it might be. Actually, she said, surprising herself, I think it was the best part of it. Ethan became very still. The city noise seemed to fade around them. For the first time all evening, something vulnerable appeared in his expression. Something lonely. Something grateful. Then he smiled. Not the polite smile he had worn earlier. Not the guarded one. A real one. And for reasons Charlotte could not explain, she had the feeling that tonight was not the end of the story. It was only the moment the first page had finally turned. The cool night air wrapped around Charlotte as she adjusted her grip on the small cake box. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving behind a silver sheen across the sidewalks and roads. Traffic moved quietly through the city, headlights reflecting in long ribbons across the wet pavement. For a few moments she and Ethan simply stood beneath the awning, neither seeming eager to step back into their separate lives. An hour earlier they had been strangers. Now walking away felt unexpectedly difficult. Charlotte glanced at the time on her phone. Nearly 11 o'clock. Her birthday was almost over. Normally that realization would have filled her with disappointment. Tonight it carried something different. Gratitude. "You should probably get home," Ethan said softly. "That sounds suspiciously like you were trying to get rid of me. I would never recover from the guilt." She smiled. "Good answer." Ethan slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "Do you always make friends with random people during storms?" "Only the ones who steal half my cake." "Borrowed." "You literally ate it." "Details." Charlotte laughed again. The sound surprised both of them. It felt lighter than it had in years. Across the street, a taxi slowed before continuing through an intersection. Somewhere nearby, music drifted faintly from a late-night restaurant. The city was settling into its quieter rhythm. Ethan looked upward toward the clouds. "The rain is finally easing. That is usually how weather works. You enjoy correcting me. You make it easy." For a second, neither spoke. Then Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. "Can I ask something?" "You already did. Several times." "One more." Charlotte nodded. "All right." Ethan studied her carefully. "What was the wish?" She froze. "What wish?" "The candle." His voice remained gentle. "You closed your eyes before I walked in." Charlotte looked away immediately. Of all the things she expected him to remember, that was not one of them. Heat rose to her cheeks. "You were paying attention?" "More than I realized." She focused on the reflections dancing across the road. "You are not supposed to tell people your birthday wish. That sounds like a rule invented by someone protecting embarrassing wishes." Charlotte smiled despite herself. "Maybe." Ethan waited patiently. He seemed remarkably good at waiting. Eventually she sighed. "It was stupid. Most honest wishes are." Charlotte hesitated again. Then she laughed quietly at herself. What difference did it make? The night was ending. They would probably never see each other again. "I wish someone would sit with me." Ethan blinked. That was it. That was it. Not money. No, not a better job. No, not a mansion overlooking the harbor. I would settle for affordable rent. Ethan laughed. Charlotte looked down at the cake box. "I just did not want to spend the whole evening alone." The confession felt oddly vulnerable once spoken aloud. Ethan became silent. His gaze shifted toward the city lights. "Then I am glad I came inside." Something about the sincerity in his voice made Charlotte's chest tighten unexpectedly. Neither of them seemed able to look directly at the other for a moment. The conversation had moved beyond jokes, beyond coincidence. It had landed somewhere real. A black car slowly rolled to the curb half a block away. Charlotte barely noticed it. Ethan did. A brief shadow crossed his expression before disappearing. "Your ride?" she asked. "Something like that." "You really are mysterious." "I have been told that before. Mostly by people trying to figure out what you actually do." "Frequently." Charlotte shook her head. "Business is still a terrible answer." "I know." Another brief silence settled between them. Comfortable. Familiar. Strange considering how little they knew about each other. Charlotte realized she did not want the evening to end. The thought startled her. She had spent years becoming comfortable on her own. Independent. Self-sufficient. Careful. Yet tonight had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. Life felt different when someone genuinely listened. Ethan glanced at his watch. For the first time all evening, disappointment flickered across his face. I should go. Charlotte nodded, though the words felt heavier than expected. Yeah. Neither moved. Then both laughed at the same time. This is ridiculous, Charlotte said. A little. We are acting like old friends. Ethan's smile softened. Maybe loneliness speeds things up. Charlotte looked at him carefully. The answer felt more truthful than either of them intended. Finally, Ethan extended his hand. Happy birthday, Charlotte. She placed her hand in his. Warm. Steady. Safe. Happy birthday, Ethan. For a second their hands remained joined. Then headlights flashed from the waiting car. Ethan released her hand and stepped back. Take care of yourself. You too. He turned and began walking toward the vehicle. Charlotte watched him go. Something inside her urged her to call out. To ask another question. To learn his surname. To ask whether they would ever meet again. But she stayed silent. Some moments felt complete precisely because they remained unfinished. Ethan reached the car door, then unexpectedly turned back. Rain mist drifted through the glow of the streetlights. Charlotte. Yeah. His smile returned. Genuine. Warm. Thank you for sharing your birthday. Before she could answer, he disappeared into the waiting car. Seconds later, it pulled away from the curb and vanished. Into the city night. Charlotte stood alone beneath the awning once more. Yet somehow she no longer felt lonely. Then her phone vibrated. One new message. Sent at 11:58 p.m. Unknown number. Charlotte frowned and opened it. Her breath caught instantly. The message contained only 7 words. Sometimes wishes arrive 2 minutes before midnight. Do not forget that. Charlotte stared at the message while the city seemed to fall silent around her. Sometimes wishes arrive 2 minutes before midnight. She read it once. Then again. Then a third time. The sender information showed only a private number. No name. No photograph. No clue. Yet she already knew who had written it. A smile slowly appeared despite herself. Ethan. The clock on her phone shifted to midnight. Her birthday was officially over. Strangely, she did not feel sad. For the first time in years, the day had not ended with disappointment. It had ended with a surprise. Charlotte slipped her phone into her handbag and started walking toward the train station. The air smelled fresh after the rain. Streetlights reflected across puddles left on the sidewalk. The city felt softer somehow, less cold. As she boarded the nearly empty train, she found herself replaying every conversation from the evening. His awkward jokes, his mysterious answers, the way he had looked at the candle. Most of all, the way he had listened. People talked constantly these days. Very few actually listened. By the time Charlotte reached her apartment building, the night had grown quiet. The old brick complex sat between 2 larger developments, squeezed into a street that developers seemed to have forgotten. She climbed 3 flights of stairs and unlocked her door. The familiar creak greeted her. The tiny flat looked exactly as she had left it that morning. Small kitchen, worn sofa, second-hand bookshelf, a collection of potted plants near the window that somehow survived despite her inconsistent care. Usually coming home amplified the loneliness. Tonight it did not. Charlotte placed the remaining cake into the refrigerator and changed into comfortable clothes. Then she made the mistake of checking social media. Birthday dinners, engagement, photos, holiday snapshots, perfect smiles, perfect lives. She scrolled for less than 30 seconds before locking the phone again. For once, those images felt less important. Real life had happened tonight. Unexpected, imperfect, and more genuine than anything on a screen. Before going to sleep, she opened the message one last time. Sometimes wishes arrive 2 minutes before midnight. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She considered replying. Thank you. Nice meeting you. Who are you really? Instead, she placed the phone on the bedside table and turned off the lamp. Some moments were better left untouched. Morning arrived too quickly. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. Charlotte groaned and reached for the alarm. Her muscles still ached from the previous day's shift. Rent was due in 6 days. Electricity in 11. Her bank account remained stubbornly unimpressed by birthday miracles. Reality had returned. Yet while brushing her teeth, she caught herself smiling at the memory of the previous evening. It happened again while making coffee, again while walking to work, again while arranging stock in the homeware section of the department store where she worked. Her colleague Megan noticed immediately. "You are in a suspiciously good mood." Charlotte looked up from a shelf of discounted kitchen appliances. "Am I?" "Definitely." Megan narrowed her eyes dramatically. "You met someone." Charlotte nearly dropped a box. "What? You met someone?" "I did not." That was not a denial. Charlotte laughed. It was 100% a denial. Megan folded her arms. "Then explain the smiling." Charlotte hesitated. How exactly was she supposed to explain a lonely stranger who borrowed half a birthday? Even saying it aloud sounded ridiculous. "I just had a surprisingly nice evening." "With someone?" "With a stranger." Megan blinked. That raises significantly more questions. Before Charlotte could answer, her manager called them back to work. Throughout the day, Charlotte found herself checking her phone more often than usual. Not obsessively, just enough to notice that no new messages arrived. She told herself she did not care. They had shared one evening. That was all. Yet disappointment quietly appeared each time the screen remained empty. Late that afternoon, nearly 24 hours after they first met, Charlotte was helping a customer compare coffee machines when her phone vibrated in her pocket. She ignored it. Work first. 10 minutes later, it vibrated again. Then once more. Concern replaced curiosity. During her break, she stepped into the staff room and finally checked the screen. 3 missed calls. Same private number. Her pulse quickened instantly. Before she could decide what to do, the phone rang again. Charlotte stared at it for 2 full seconds. Then answered. "Hello." Silence. Not empty silence. Breathing. Someone was there. "Hello," she repeated. Then she heard Ethan's voice. Calm. Familiar. Somehow already recognizable. "I was beginning to think you had blocked me." Charlotte felt a laugh escape before she could stop it. "I was working." That is a much healthier explanation. She leaned against the wall. "How did you get my number?" "I could claim extraordinary detective skills. But your loyalty card was sitting on the cafe table." Charlotte covered her face with one hand. "You are kidding." "I am afraid not." "That is embarrassing." "A little. You could have stolen my identity." "I borrowed your birthday. Let us not get carried away." Charlotte laughed again. The same warmth returned immediately. Familiar. Easy. Unexpected. Neither of them noticed that her 15-minute break had already ended. Neither of them noticed anything except the simple fact that despite all logic, neither one had wanted the conversation to be over. Charlotte remained in the staff room long after her break should have ended, holding the phone against her ear while trying unsuccessfully to stop smiling. Ethan seemed to notice immediately. "You are smiling, aren't you?" he asked. "You cannot possibly know that." "I can hear it. That is not a real thing." "It absolutely is." Charlotte shook her head, even though he could not see her. Outside the staff room door, trolleys rolled across the floor and employees called to one another, but somehow his voice made all of it seem distant. "So," Ethan continued, "how many workplace rules are we breaking right now?" "Several." "Excellent." That was not supposed to be the correct answer. He laughed softly. "Sorry, I am out of practice." Charlotte leaned against the wall. "Out of practice with what?" A brief pause followed. "Talking to people." The honesty surprised her. Most people hid statements like that behind jokes. Ethan simply said it. "You seemed pretty capable of talking the other night." "That was different." "How?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Because you were not expecting anything from me." Charlotte found herself thinking about that after the call ended. They spoke for nearly 40 minutes before reality forced them back to their responsibilities. When she finally returned to the shop floor, Megan was waiting beside a display of kitchenware with crossed arms and an expression that suggested she had already invented 17 theories. "You met someone," Megan announced immediately. "You already said that. And now I am correct." Charlotte laughed and continued arranging stock. "You are impossible." Was it the mysterious stranger? Charlotte froze for half a second. Megan pointed dramatically. "That reaction means yes." Customers came and went. Receipts printed. Questions were answered. Yet every so often Charlotte caught herself remembering something Ethan had said. The way he listened. The strange loneliness beneath his humor. The feeling that he was carrying far more than he ever admitted. By closing time, rain clouds had returned, gathering across the evening sky. Charlotte stepped outside and immediately reached for her umbrella. Before she could open it, her phone vibrated. One message. "Ethan. Survived work? Charlotte smiled. Barely. Your concern is touching. Several seconds later, another message appeared. I am standing in a boardroom, pretending to pay attention. That made her stop walking. Boardroom. Interesting. Business suddenly sounded slightly more believable. She typed back. Important meeting? The reply came almost immediately. Apparently. Charlotte laughed out loud on the sidewalk. A passing pedestrian glanced at her curiously. For the next week, a pattern emerged. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just steady. Morning messages. Occasional calls. Small conversations squeezed between responsibilities. Ethan never flooded her with attention. Charlotte never demanded explanations. Somehow the friendship grew naturally, like two people gradually discovering they had been lonely in similar ways. What surprised Charlotte most was how normal it felt. There were no grand declarations. No attempts to impress her. Ethan never mentioned money. Never mentioned achievements. Never spoke about success. Instead, he asked questions. Real questions. What book was she reading? Which coffee shop made the best latte? What had she wanted to become when she was 12 years old? Nobody had asked her things like that in years, and nobody had waited as though her answers mattered. One Thursday evening, she found herself sitting on her small balcony watching clouds drift across the fading sunset while speaking to him on the phone. Can I ask you something? She said. You usually do. Why are you always working? Silence greeted the question. That is specific. It is also true. Charlotte tucked her legs beneath a blanket. Every time I call, you are leaving a meeting, entering a meeting, escaping a meeting, hiding from a meeting. Ethan sighed dramatically. I dislike how observant you are. Answer the question. For several moments, only the distant sound of city traffic filled the line. Then Ethan spoke quietly. Because work is easier. Charlotte frowned. Easier than what? Everything else. The answer lingered between them. She did not push further. Something told her he had already revealed more than he intended. A cool breeze moved across the balcony. The first stars were beginning to appear overhead. You know, Charlotte said eventually. For someone who claims to be terrible at talking to people, you call me quite a lot. That is because you are different. Her heart stumbled unexpectedly. Different how? Ethan laughed softly. You ask dangerous questions. Charlotte smiled despite herself. That is not an answer. Maybe not. His voice grew quieter. Warmer. But it is the truth. Charlotte stared out at the city lights beginning to appear beyond the rooftops. Somewhere along the way, the stranger from the cafe had become part of her days, part of her routines, part of her thoughts. She still did not know exactly who he was. Yet for reasons she could not explain, she trusted him. And far across the city, sitting alone in an office overlooking hundreds of illuminated windows, Ethan Whitmore lowered his phone and looked out at the skyline. For the first time in a very long time, the view felt less empty than it used to. The following Tuesday began like any other. Charlotte arrived at work 10 minutes early, carrying a takeout coffee and mentally calculating how much remained in her account after rent. By mid-morning, she was helping a customer choose storage containers when her manager appeared beside her with an unusually serious expression. Charlotte, can I see you in the office for a minute? Her stomach tightened instantly. Nobody ever wanted to see an employee in the office for good reasons. Charlotte followed him down the narrow corridor, running through possible mistakes she might have made. Had she forgotten a shift? Mishandled a return? Accidentally offended a customer? The office door closed behind them. Her manager sat down and removed his glasses. That alone felt ominous. I am sorry, he said. Charlotte's heart sank. The company is restructuring. She already knew what was coming. The words arrived anyway. Reduced staffing, budget pressures, difficult decisions. None of it felt personal. Somehow that made it worse. 20 minutes later, Charlotte walked back onto the shop floor carrying a cardboard box containing a framed photo, a water bottle, and a small potted plant. Employees offered sympathetic smiles. Megan hugged her tightly. Charlotte thanked everyone and pretended she was handling it well. She was not. Outside, gray clouds hung low across the city. The wind had picked up. By the time she reached the train station, her thoughts had become a tangled mess of calculations and worries. Rent, bills, groceries, job applications. She sat on a bench and stared at the departing trains. Her phone buzzed. Ethan, how is your day going? Charlotte almost ignored it. Instead, she typed 3 words. Not very well. The response arrived less than 10 seconds later. Are you okay? She hesitated, then told him the truth. Lost my job today. The typing indicator appeared instantly. Disappeared. Reappeared. Finally, a message arrived. Where are you? Charlotte frowned. At the station. Another reply followed. Stay there. Charlotte stared at the screen. Stay there? What kind of answer was that? She called immediately. Ethan answered on the first ring. What does stay there mean? She demanded. It means stay there. That is not an explanation. I know. Ethan. Charlotte. She could hear movement in the background. Doors closing. Voices. Footsteps. Are you working? She asked. Not anymore. What does that mean? It means I am leaving. Charlotte sat upright. Leaving where? A meeting. Because of me? Silence answered first. Then came his calm voice. Nobody should have to sit alone on a day that feels heavy. The words stole her reply. Around her, commuters hurried past carrying umbrellas and briefcases. The city kept moving. Yet for a moment, everything seemed to slow. You do not have to do that, she said quietly. I know. Then why are you? Another pause. Because somebody once shared a birthday cake with a stranger. Charlotte felt unexpected emotion rise in her chest. Before she could answer, the call ended. 25 minutes later, a black car pulled up outside the station. Charlotte stared as the rear door opened and Ethan stepped out. The first thing she noticed was that he looked genuinely concerned. The second was that he appeared far more polished than usual. Dark suit, crisp white shirt, expensive overcoat. He looked less like a man who worked in business and more like the person everyone in the building tried not to disappoint. Ethan crossed the pavement toward her. Hi. Charlotte laughed despite herself. Hi. You look terrible. You are repeating your earlier mistake. Right? Sorry. That earned the first real smile she had managed all afternoon. Ethan sat beside her on the bench. Neither spoke immediately. He did not ask for details. Did not offer solutions. Did not tell her everything would be fine. Instead, he simply sat there. Exactly as she had once wished someone would. The wind stirred fallen leaves along the platform. A train arrived and departed. Minutes passed. Finally, Charlotte exhaled slowly. I am scared. Ethan nodded. I know. I worked hard. I know. And now I have no idea what comes next. For several seconds, Ethan stared at the tracks stretching into the distance. Then he said something so quietly she almost missed it. Neither do I. Charlotte turned toward him. What? A faint smile touched his face. You are not the only one standing at a crossroads. She studied him carefully. The answer carried more meaning than the words themselves. For the first time since they met, she realized something important. Ethan Whitmore was hiding something. Not something dangerous. Not exactly dishonest. Something painful. And whatever it was, it had been following him long before he ever walked into that cafe. Charlotte looked at Ethan for several seconds after he spoke. Neither do I. The answer lingered in the cool afternoon air long after the words themselves had faded. Trains continued arriving and departing behind them. Commuters hurried along the platform carrying backpacks, umbrellas, and takeout coffees. Life moved forward around them. Yet Charlotte could not shake the feeling that Ethan had just revealed something important without actually explaining anything. You do not seem like someone who does not know what comes next, she said quietly. Ethan smiled, though there was little amusement behind it. That is because I have had years of practice pretending. Charlotte studied him carefully. The wind tugged lightly at his coat. For the first time since they met, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. Pretending what? She asked. Ethan glanced toward the city skyline visible beyond the station buildings. That having a plan is the same thing as having a life. Charlotte frowned. That sounds suspiciously deep. That usually means it came from experience. She wanted to ask more. Wanted to understand what burden he was carrying. But instinct told her not to push. Whatever story existed behind his eyes had taken years to build. It was not going to be told in a single afternoon. Instead, she leaned back against the bench and let out a slow breath. Well, my current plan consists mostly of updating my resume and panicking. An understandable strategy. Thank you. Though I would recommend less panicking. Easy for you to say. Ethan laughed softly. Fair point. A comfortable silence settled between them. The sort that had become strangely common whenever they were together. Eventually, Ethan stood and offered a hand. Come on. Charlotte looked up. Where are we going? For coffee. I cannot really justify spending money on coffee right now. Then it is fortunate that I can. That sounds suspiciously generous. I am trying to maintain my reputation as a man who steals cake and buys coffee. Charlotte rolled her eyes but accepted his hand. 20 minutes later, they sat beside a large window in a quiet cafe overlooking the harbor. Ferries crossed the water in the distance. Sunlight occasionally broke through the clouds, turning the surface into shifting silver. Charlotte wrapped both hands around her cup. This place is nice. I come here sometimes. When you are escaping meetings? Mostly. She smiled. You know, one day I am going to figure out what you actually do. I look forward to that investigation. Charlotte shook her head. The conversation drifted naturally after that. Books, travel, childhood memories, embarrassing school stories. Then Ethan excused himself to take a call. Work? Charlotte asked. Unfortunately. Try not to accidentally purchase a country while you are gone. I will do my best. He stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the water. Charlotte watched him through the glass without really meaning to. His posture changed the moment he answered the phone. Straighter, more focused, more authoritative. Whatever business he worked in, people clearly listened when he spoke. As she glanced away, something caught her eye on the chair beside him. A leather wallet partially open. Charlotte would never normally snoop. The idea barely crossed her mind. Yet a photograph visible inside the wallet drew her attention immediately. It showed a younger Ethan standing beside an elegant woman with warm eyes and dark hair. Both were smiling, truly smiling. Not the polite expressions people wore for cameras, the kind that reached all the way into their eyes. Charlotte realized she had never seen Ethan smile like that. Not once. The photograph disappeared as he returned and picked up the wallet. Yet the image stayed with her. They spent another hour talking before the afternoon faded toward evening. Eventually, Charlotte checked the time and sighed. I should head home. Ethan nodded, though disappointment flickered briefly across his face. You probably should. Look at us. Being responsible adults. It feels unnatural. They left the cafe together and walked toward the ferry terminal. The harbor breeze carried the scent of salt and rain. For a few minutes, neither spoke. Then Charlotte stopped walking. Ethan turned toward her. What is it? She hesitated. The woman in the photograph. Ethan became completely still. Charlotte immediately wondered if she had made a mistake. Sorry, she said quickly. I did not mean to pry. For several seconds he said nothing. The harbor noise seemed to fade into the background. Then he looked down at the water. That was my mother. Charlotte's expression softened. She looks kind. A faint smile touched his face. Sad and warm at the same time. She was. The answer was simple. Yet somehow it explained everything. The loneliness. The birthdays. The sadness hidden beneath his humor. Charlotte felt her heart ache for him. Neither spoke again for a moment. Then Ethan looked out across the water and quietly added, She died on my birthday. The harbor seemed quieter after Ethan spoke. She died on my birthday. Charlotte felt the words settle heavily between them. Suddenly, so many pieces fell into place. The loneliness. The reluctance to celebrate. The strange sadness that appeared whenever birthdays were mentioned. The photograph. The candle. The way he had stared at that tiny flame in the cafe as though it carried memories nobody else could see. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The late afternoon sun reflected across the water in scattered flashes of gold. Ferries moved slowly across the harbor. Seagulls drifted overhead. Life continued around them, while something deeply personal stood exposed between two people who had once been strangers. Charlotte finally broke the silence. I am sorry, Ethan. He nodded slightly. Thank you. His voice remained calm, but she could hear the effort behind it. How old were you? She asked gently. Ethan looked out toward the horizon. 14. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. 14. Old enough to remember everything. Young enough for it to change the shape of an entire life. That must have been hard. A faint smile appeared. Not because anything was funny. Because some truths were too large for ordinary answers. That is one way to describe it. Charlotte waited. Eventually, Ethan continued. My mother was the person who made everything feel possible. She had this gift. He paused. She could walk into a room and somehow make everyone feel important. Charlotte immediately understood. Like she saw people. Ethan glanced at her, surprised. Exactly. His smile softened. Most people listen so they can reply. She listened because she genuinely wanted to understand. Charlotte looked down briefly. You sound like her sometimes. Ethan became very still. The compliment seemed to affect him more than she expected. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked away toward the water again. That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me in years. The breeze carried the scent of salt and approaching rain. Clouds were beginning to gather in the distance. Charlotte leaned against the railing. What happened after she passed away? Ethan let out a slow breath. Work happened. You were 14. Not immediately. A shadow crossed his expression. But eventually I discovered that if I stayed busy enough, I did not have to think about what was missing. Charlotte nodded slowly. She understood that feeling better than she wished she did. People filled emptiness in different ways. Some with noise. Some with distractions. Some with endless schedules. Did it work? She asked quietly. Ethan laughed softly. For a while. And now? His eyes met hers. Honest. Tired. Unusually vulnerable. Now I am not so sure. Charlotte felt something shift inside her. Over the past few weeks, she had come to care about him in ways she had not anticipated. Not because of mystery. Not because of charm. Because beneath everything else, Ethan carried his pain with kindness instead of bitterness. That was rare. Increasingly rare. The first drops of rain began to fall. Small circles appeared across the harbor surface. Neither moved. You know something? Charlotte said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. Probably. A smile touched her lips. I think your mother would be disappointed. He blinked. Disappointed? Not in you. Charlotte shook her head. In the fact that you spent years punishing yourself every birthday. Ethan stared at her. The rain gradually intensified around them. You never met her? No. Then how can you know that? Charlotte smiled gently. Because people who spend their lives making others feel important do not want the people they love spending decades treating joy like a betrayal. The words landed with surprising force. Ethan looked away immediately. His jaw tightened. For a brief moment, Charlotte wondered if she had gone too far. Then he laughed. A quiet laugh filled with emotion. You have a habit of saying exactly what I need to hear. That sounds unlikely. It is unfortunately true. They finally began walking toward the terminal as the rain strengthened. Ethan opened an umbrella and held it above both of them. The gesture felt natural now. Comfortable. Familiar. As though somewhere along the way they had stopped being two lonely people sharing conversations and started becoming something neither had expected. When they reached the entrance, Charlotte turned toward him. Promise me something. Ethan looked curious. That depends. Next birthday. That already sounds dangerous. Next birthday, she repeated firmly. You will not spend it alone. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time since she had met him, she saw genuine uncertainty cross his face. Finally, he smiled. Small. Real. Hopeful. Maybe next year will not hurt this much. Charlotte froze. It was the exact sentence she had spoken outside the cafe weeks ago. The sentence he had somehow remembered. The sentence she had almost forgotten. And standing there beneath the umbrella, watching the rain fall beyond the harbor lights, Charlotte realized something that frightened and comforted her at the same time. Ethan Whitmore remembered everything that mattered. The rain continued long after they said goodbye at the terminal. Charlotte sat beside the window on the train ride home, watching droplets race across the glass while Ethan's words replayed in her mind. Maybe next year will not hurt this much. She smiled softly. It was strange how one sentence could feel both hopeful and heartbreaking at the same time. Across the city, Ethan stood alone in the back seat of a moving car, staring out at the same rain-covered streets. The driver occasionally glanced in the mirror, sensing that his passenger was unusually distracted. Ethan barely noticed. His thoughts remained fixed on Charlotte, on the way she listened, on the way she somehow managed to make difficult truths feel lighter without pretending they did not exist. His phone vibrated. A message from his executive assistant appeared on the screen. Reminder, board meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. Investors arriving from Sydney at 10:30 a.m. Ethan closed the message without replying. A second notification followed almost immediately. The quarterly acquisition documents require your approval. He closed that one too. For the first time in years, the endless stream of business updates felt strangely unimportant. The next morning began before sunrise. Charlotte sat at her small kitchen table surrounded by printed resumes, job listings, and a notebook filled with calculations. The reality of unemployment had fully arrived. She highlighted application deadlines while sipping coffee that had grown cold an hour earlier. Every position seemed to demand more experience, more qualifications, or more availability than she could offer. By midday, she had submitted 7 applications and received exactly 0 responses. The silence felt familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Her phone buzzed. Ethan, how many companies have realized they desperately need you today? Charlotte smiled despite herself. Approximately none. That seems short-sighted of them. She laughed quietly and typed back. I appreciate your confidence. Several seconds later his reply appeared. It is not confidence. It is observation. The message warmed her more than she expected. Over the following days, job hunting became her routine. Applications, emails, interviews that led nowhere, automated rejection notices. Through it all, Ethan remained a constant presence. Sometimes it was a phone call, sometimes a message, sometimes nothing more than a simple question asking whether she had remembered to eat lunch. Small things. Yet the small things often mattered most. One Friday afternoon, Charlotte attended an interview for a customer service position at a growing corporate firm. The office occupied the upper floors of a modern glass building overlooking the city. She arrived 15 minutes early, wearing her best outfit and carrying a folder filled with references. The reception area was elegant enough to make her immediately aware of every inexpensive detail in her wardrobe. Still, she lifted her shoulders and reminded herself that confidence cost nothing. The receptionist offered a polite smile. The hiring manager is running slightly behind schedule. No problem. Charlotte sat down and waited. Minutes passed. Employees moved through the lobby carrying laptops and takeout coffees. Conversations echoed from nearby meeting rooms. Everything felt polished, successful, efficient, the sort of place where people seemed to know exactly where their lives were going. Charlotte checked her phone. A new message from Ethan appeared. Big interview today. You will do great. She smiled instantly. How do you always remember everything? His response arrived almost immediately. Because you matter, more than you seem to believe. Charlotte stared at the screen. Her heart stumbled unexpectedly. Before she could decide how to reply, movement near the reception desk caught her attention. A group of executives entered the lobby from a private lift. 4 men and 2 women. Expensive suits. Serious expressions. The sort of people who clearly occupied the highest levels of the company. Charlotte barely glanced up at first. Then one familiar voice drifted across the room. Move the investor briefing to 3 o'clock. Her breath caught. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. Slowly, almost afraid to look, she lifted her eyes. Ethan was walking at the center of the group. Confident, focused, commanding. Every person around him listened when he spoke. Employees nodded respectfully as he passed. The receptionist immediately stood straighter. The entire atmosphere of the lobby shifted around his presence. Charlotte froze. For one impossible second, their eyes met across the room. Ethan stopped walking. The conversation around him abruptly faded. Shock flashed across his face. Real shock. Not because he had seen her, because she had seen him. The silence between them lasted only a moment. Yet in that moment, Charlotte understood something she should have realized long ago. Ethan Whitmore had never been merely a man who worked in business. He was the man people in business rearranged their voices for. And whatever truth he had been avoiding was finally standing directly in front of both of them. Charlotte forgot about the interview, forgot about the folder in her hands, forgot about the carefully prepared answers she had rehearsed on the train. All she could do was stare at Ethan standing in the center of the lobby while an entire group of executives waited for him to continue walking. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt much longer. Ethan recovered first. Years of experience hid his surprise behind a calm expression, but Charlotte knew him well enough now to see it. He had not expected this. Neither had she. One of the executives beside him began speaking about a presentation schedule. Ethan did not appear to hear a word. His attention remained fixed on Charlotte. Then, with the slightest nod, he turned back toward his colleagues and continued toward the private lifts. The lobby noise returned. Conversations resumed. Phones rang. Footsteps echoed across polished floors. Yet Charlotte remained frozen in place. The receptionist finally approached her. Miss Hayes. Charlotte blinked. Sorry. The hiring manager is ready for you now. Somehow she managed to stand. Somehow she followed the receptionist through a corridor lined with glass offices and framed awards. Somehow she sat through the interview. Later, she would remember almost none of it. But her mind remained trapped in that moment in the lobby. By the time the interview ended, confusion had replaced surprise. Ethan had never technically lied to her. He had simply never told her the truth. Business. The word suddenly seemed almost funny. As Charlotte exited the building, Her phone vibrated. One message. Ethan, I owe you an explanation. She stared at the screen for several seconds before replying. I think you do. Another message arrived immediately. Can we talk tonight? Charlotte hesitated. Part of her felt hurt. Another part understood there was probably more to the story than she could currently see. Finally, she typed back. Yes. At 7 o'clock that evening, Charlotte arrived at the same harbor cafe where they had spent time before. The sky glowed with the last colors of sunset. Ferries moved across darkening water. She spotted Ethan immediately. He was already seated at a table near the window. For the first time since meeting him, he looked genuinely nervous. Charlotte sat down across from him. Neither spoke for a moment. Ethan wrapped both hands around a coffee cup that had long gone untouched. You are angry, he said quietly. Charlotte considered the question. I am not sure. Ethan nodded slowly. That is probably worse. A faint smile almost appeared before fading again. Finally, Charlotte leaned back in her chair. Who are you, Ethan? He looked out at the harbor lights. My name is Ethan Whitmore. That part one knew. I am the chief executive officer of Whitmore Capital. The words landed heavily between them. Charlotte had heard the name before. Everyone had. Whitmore Capital was one of the largest investment firms in the country. Newspapers mentioned it constantly. Business channels discussed it daily. Suddenly, the expensive suits, the meetings, the black car, the private lifts, and the executives all made sense. You own that company? She asked quietly. Ethan nodded. Yes. Charlotte exhaled slowly. Wow. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she asked, the question that truly mattered. Why did you not tell me? Ethan lowered his gaze. Because I liked who I was when I was with you. Charlotte frowned slightly. He continued before she could respond. The night we met, you did not know anything about my job. You did not care about money. You did not care about status. You treated me like a person. His voice remained calm, but emotion lingered beneath every word. Most people meet Ethan Whitmore before they meet me. Charlotte listened silently. Ethan looked toward the harbor again. You met me first. The answer caught her off guard. It was not manipulation. It was not arrogance. It was loneliness. The same loneliness she had seen from the beginning. The same loneliness that had walked into a cafe carrying rain on its shoulders. You should have trusted me enough to tell me, she said gently. Ethan nodded immediately. You are right. No excuses. No arguments. Just honesty. Somehow that mattered. Charlotte looked down at the table. Do you know what upset me most? What? Not that you are wealthy. Ethan waited. It is that for a few hours today, I wondered whether any of our conversations were real. Pain flashed across his face instantly. Genuine pain. Charlotte. His voice was barely above a whisper. Every conversation was real. She looked up. The sincerity in his eyes left no room for doubt. Every phone call. Every message. Every coffee. Every terrible joke. Especially the ones that should have embarrassed me. A small smile finally appeared. Especially the terrible jokes? Especially those. Charlotte laughed softly despite herself. The tension between them eased slightly. Outside, the final light disappeared beyond the horizon. Harbor lights reflected across the water. And for the first time since entering the lobby that afternoon, Charlotte began to realize that the truth had changed many things. But it had not changed the person sitting across from her. Charlotte sat quietly for a moment after Ethan's words settled between them. The harbor lights shimmered beyond the window, turning the dark water into a field of scattered gold. Around them, conversations drifted through the cafe. Cups clinked. Softly, a barista laughed somewhere behind the counter. Yet nothing about the evening felt ordinary anymore. Ethan Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer, one of the most successful businessmen in the country. The information should have changed everything. Somehow, once the shock passed, it did not change the thing that mattered. Charlotte looked at the man across from her and still saw the same person who had walked into a nearly empty cafe, carrying rain on his shoulders. The same person who had shared her birthday cake. The same person who remembered small details nobody else seemed to notice. What happened after your mother died? She asked quietly. Ethan looked surprised by the question. That is what you want to know? Charlotte nodded. Yes. He studied her face for a second, as though confirming she was serious. Then he smiled faintly. Most people would have asked about the company. Most people probably have better financial instincts than I do. That earned a genuine laugh. The tension eased a little more. Ethan looked down at his coffee. After she died, everything became about achievement. His voice remained calm. School, college, work, goals, targets, bigger goals, bigger targets. Charlotte listened carefully. And eventually I became successful enough that nobody asked whether I was happy. The honesty of the statement lingered between them. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. Success. People chased it their entire lives. Yet sitting across from Ethan, she could see how easily accomplishment and happiness became completely different things. That sounds lonely. Ethan smiled sadly. It was efficient. Charlotte laughed softly. That is not the same thing. No, his eyes met hers. It is not. Silence settled again. Comfortable now. Familiar. Outside, a ferry crossed the harbor carrying bright reflections across the water. Charlotte thought about the previous weeks. The messages. The phone calls. The unexpected friendship that had arrived during one of the hardest periods of her life. Then she thought about the interview earlier that day. A realization suddenly struck her. Wait. Ethan looked up. What? The company. What company? The one I interviewed with today. Ethan immediately understood. Oh. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. Oh. That does not sound promising. Because it is not. She leaned forward. Tell me the truth. Ethan sighed. Whitmore Capital owns a majority stake. Charlotte stared at him. Of course it does. In my defense, I did not know you were interviewing there. You genuinely did not. Charlotte, if I had known, I would have warned you before you experienced the most intimidating lobby in Seattle. She laughed despite herself. Fair. Ethan smiled. For what it is worth, I had absolutely nothing to do with the interview process. I believe you. Thank you. Charlotte looked out at the harbor again. I'm still not sure whether I got the job. Ethan tilted his head thoughtfully. Do you want it? The question surprised her. Nobody had asked that. Everyone focused on whether she needed a job, whether she could get a job, not whether she actually wanted one. Charlotte considered the answer carefully. Not really. Ethan nodded. Then perhaps the outcome matters less than you think. She blinked. You make that sound very simple. It rarely is. His smile softened. But sometimes losing one thing creates room for something better. Charlotte stared at him for a moment. That sounds suspiciously like advice. Do not tell anyone. I have a reputation to protect. They both laughed. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The secret no longer stood between them. The truth was finally in the open. And strangely, the truth felt smaller than the connection they had built before it existed. Eventually, the cafe began preparing to close. Chairs were stacked. Lights dimmed slightly. Charlotte gathered her things and stood. Ethan did the same. They walked outside together into the cool night air. The rain had stopped completely. Above them, a few stars had appeared between drifting clouds. For a moment, neither moved toward their separate paths. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. What is that? Charlotte asked. Something I have carried for years. He handed it to her. Charlotte unfolded it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting was elegant and warm. She read the first line silently. Ethan watched her expression. My mother wrote that for me when I was 14, he said softly. Charlotte looked back down at the page. One sentence immediately stood out from all the others. If life ever feels too heavy, find people who remind you who you are when you are smiling. Charlotte's throat tightened. She looked up slowly. Ethan's eyes held hers. You asked why I came into that cafe, he said quietly. The truth is, I do not think I was looking for a birthday celebration. The harbor lights reflected softly behind him. I think I was looking for that feeling again. Charlotte stood beneath the harbor lights holding the folded note in both hands. The paper felt fragile, precious, as though it carried far more than ink. If life ever feels too heavy, find people who remind you who you are when you are smiling. She read the sentence again, then looked at Ethan. For a moment, neither spoke. The city glowed around them. Reflections danced across the dark water. A cool breeze drifted through the marina carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. Charlotte suddenly understood something that had been quietly unfolding since the night they met. Neither of them had saved the other. Life was not that simple. Bills still existed. Grief still existed. Uncertainty still existed. What had changed was smaller than that, and somehow more important. They had reminded each other that loneliness was not permanent. Ethan smiled softly. My mother used to write notes all the time. Charlotte folded the paper carefully and handed it back. She sounds wonderful. She was. He slipped the note into his wallet beside the photograph. I spent years thinking success would eventually fill the space she left behind. His gaze drifted toward the harbor. Turns out success is terrible at giving hugs, remembering birthdays, or asking whether you made it home safely. Charlotte laughed. That is probably the most honest thing a billionaire has ever said. Ethan looked amused. You are adjusting to the billionaire part surprisingly quickly. I am trying to be mature. How is that going? Poorly. That earned another laugh. The sound warmed something inside both of them. It had become familiar now. Comfortable. Natural. Charlotte glanced at the time. I should probably go home. Ethan nodded. You probably should. Neither moved. They both noticed. They both smiled. This feels familiar, Charlotte said. A little. The silence that followed felt different from all the others. Not uncertain. Not awkward. Full. As though neither person needed additional words to understand what mattered. Ethan finally spoke. You know, there is something else I should tell you. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Should I sit down for this? Possibly. That sounds concerning. Ethan smiled. The company called this afternoon. Charlotte immediately understood. The interview. The interview. Her heart skipped. And Ethan folded his arms. Do you want the official answer or the dramatic version? The official answer. You were offered the position. Charlotte stared at him. Seriously? Seriously. For 1 second, she looked completely stunned. Then relief flooded across her face. Genuine relief. Not because the position was perfect. Not because every problem had suddenly disappeared. Because for the first time in weeks, uncertainty loosened its grip. I got the job, she repeated. Ethan nodded. You got the job. Charlotte laughed and covered her face with both hands. I cannot believe it. I can. She lowered her hands. You already knew. A few hours ago. And you waited? I wanted the moment to belong to you. Charlotte shook her head. You are annoyingly thoughtful. I receive that complaint often. For several minutes, they stood there talking about practical things. Start dates. New opportunities. Future possibilities. Yet beneath every conversation flowed a quieter truth. Neither one was talking only about a job anymore. They were talking about hope. About moving forward. About believing tomorrow might hold something better than yesterday. Eventually Charlotte took a step backward. Then another. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Charlotte. She smiled. And thank you. Ethan looked genuinely confused. For what? Charlotte thought about the answer. For the phone calls. For the coffee. For listening. For showing up at a train station on one of the worst days of her life. For reminding her she mattered. Yet none of those explanations felt complete. So she told the truth. For sitting down. Ethan's expression softened immediately. He understood. Of course he understood. The memory returned to both of them at the same time. One small candle. One lonely birthday. One empty chair. Ethan smiled. Thank you for sharing the cake. Charlotte laughed. Then she turned and began walking toward the station. Halfway there she glanced back. Ethan remained standing beside the harbor watching her leave. Not because he was worried. Not because he was uncertain. Because some people arrive in your life quietly and somehow leave it brighter than they found it, even before they know they are doing it. Months later, Charlotte would often think about that birthday. Friends would assume the best gift had been the new job. Others would assume it was meeting a successful man. They would all be wrong. The real gift arrived in a nearly empty cafe with rain on its shoulders and loneliness in its eyes. It arrived disguised as a stranger asking an absurd question. It arrived when she had almost stopped expecting anything good to happen. Because sometimes life does not change through grand miracles. Sometimes it changes because someone notices an empty chair and decides to sit down. And sometimes the people who help us heal are not the ones who arrive with perfect solutions. They are the ones who notice the empty chair, sit down without making a performance of it, and remind us that even on the hardest days, we do not have to face life alone. If this story made you think of someone who once sat beside you when you needed it most, leave their initials in the comments and subscribe before you go. The next story might be the one someone else needs tonight.